if it's there.
Okay.
If you want to make it bigger. I don't know if that's full screen.
So are you aren't seeing, let's just do this. You aren't seeing like full screen now?
I am. Is everybody else?
No, but that could be because I haven't done it in the right way. I've got half of you, Finley, and half of the plane, and then lots of little ones at the bottom. I don't know this program. I know Zoom.
Okay. There you go. Is that better?
You're going to look at more options. Don't let me hold you back.
That's okay. Well, it's just I want to make sure people can see what I'm presenting, though. So, is that the same problem for everybody, or can most people see the full screen?
I've also got the half screen.
Okay, and is the other half my face? Like, can you?
Yep.
Okay.
Is that better?
But if I get close enough, I can read it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I think go for it.
I wonder. Yeah, I wonder if you can like move it so that my face is smaller and my screen is bigger. I can't. I can't see what you're seeing though. Is the only problem.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Better?
That's better. Yes.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. So awesome. Do shout. I mean, there is the raise the hand functionality, because I can't see you at the moment. So if there's a question, a specific question you've got as I'm talking, feel free to put your hand up and I can clarify anything for you. So my group is Safe Landing. We are aviation workers. I'm an aerospace engineer. My background is I worked at Rolls-Royce. I'm one of the biggest aircraft engine manufacturers, and I was designing future engines for future aircraft with Airbus and Boeing. So I've got quite a good understanding of different technology. And while I still worked there, I also did a lot of investigations into things like the fuels, and hydrogen and electric and that sort of thing. And Sally's asked me to focus on sustainable aviation fuel today. So within our group, we think that it's really important that we are honest with ourselves about what's possible with technology. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of greenwash from our industry, which in the short term is giving it this kind of apparent license to grow because we think we can continue to increase air traffic without causing additional environmental impact. And we think, if we're misleading other people, ultimately we're also misleading ourselves, and that's going to come around and hurt us in the future because we can't keep that charade up forever. So just a little bit about the principles of our group. So we think our industry should firstly be honest about the environmental impact of flying. That includes carbon, but it also includes noise, air pollution, contrails that also cause global warming. We need to be realistic about the limits of technology. We're not going to be able to scale technology in time to solve this problem. We're going to need something else. That something else is policies. So we need to be transparent about future regulations required to reduce emissions. Those are going to have to be regulations that result in less flying, make it more expensive to fly, and we need to acknowledge those and work through them. And we need to have a plan that accounts for all of that and supports workers during the transition. So our positions at a high level is that flying has a high environmental impact. It's highly unfair and inequitable. It's only a small minority of the population fly. Technology will not be available at scale in the time required. So net zero by 2050 is not relevant. What's relevant is the carbon budget, and we are going to blow that for 1.5 if we've not already, and for 2 degrees in the next 10 to 15 years. So we need to be thinking with that timescale in mind. Future regulations are vital, and that will mean limiting air traffic capacity, which is why we think it's not the right time to expand our major airports with business as usual. And acknowledging this and planning for this, we think, is in all of our best interests. It might seem unusual for an aviation worker to be saying this, but we think that actually if we accept reality, then we could get on and we can actually properly fix it. And in fixing it, we can actually create more jobs, and we can preserve our ability to still have a planet to travel to still be able to fly in 20 years' time. But we need to moderate what we do in the short term, buy ourselves time and properly change. And we think that'll be good for aviation workers as well. And I think that's just a really important point to make. And you need to make as campaigners, right, you don't want to demonize workers. We want to show that actually there's a way through this where everybody can win, and it's in all of our self-interest. So something we do as a group is we go and look at different topics in the industry, and we go away and we produce detailed positions through discussions and debate and dialogue. This is a position that we produced on Sustainable Aviation Fuel earlier this year. I think it was in May. So it's quite recent, and we go through some different topics in quite detail. I've got a bit of a technical background. I've been looking at this in detail, but hopefully, I'm sure you've seen some stuff around sustainable aviation fuel before, so hopefully you might appreciate some of this detail here. I'll try and not get too technical, but bear with me when I do. So when we talk about sustainable aviation fuels, we're generally referring to either biofuels, which are produced from biomass, biogenic material like plants, or waste from plants, so something that we've eaten or something that we've wasted in the food process, and we're turning the carbon in that into a hydrocarbon fuel, or e-fuels, where we get the carbon from the atmosphere using electricity, and we get that industrially, and we also create hydrogen industrially using electricity, and we get a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. Both of these things aim to substitute conventional jet fuel or fossil fuel kerosene. And the idea is they can be a drop-in replacement for it, so we don't need to change our aircraft. We just need this alternative fuel. And so the saying goes, we just need subsidies. We need government support for these to scale it up, and it'll be problem solved. Now, just to start off with terminology, we do not like the use of the term sustainable aviation fuel. We prefer to use the term alternative jet fuel, and rather than SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel. And this is because we think it's a wrong assumption to assume that any alternative to fossil fuel is by definition sustainable. We think that actually that needs to be assessed and that needs to be proven. And when you dig into the majority of the fuels that are proposed, if you consider doing them at scale, there's a lot of environmental risks, ecological risks, and societal risks that come from trying to produce these fuels at the scale we currently use fossil fuel. And I'll get into that. So our group uses alternative jet fuel instead when we talk about this, and we encourage journalists, the media, government to not use that term either, because we don't think it's helpful.
Finley, may I just ask if you've shared, if you've moved on a slide yet?
Yeah. So
moving on, any?
So the current, let me just stop sharing. Were you just seeing the first?
Yeah, the first slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had moved like a few different slides. How about if let me just see if I share what I could try and do. If I put it in this screen. I'm going to do a different type of screen share, because I can do a share screen one.
Put the presentation in presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to switch this around actually, sorry. So this is annoying. When I do presentation mode, it switches to the other screen. So let me do this. I don't know if this is going to work, but hopefully it does. Other option is power screen 2, share. So does that work?
Yeah, try
And-
going to, yeah, I've got it.
Okay.
Can someone else give me a thumbs up or a yes? Yes, right, we're good. We're good to go.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, this is the stuff I was presenting so far. Biofuels and e-fuels. Sorry, I thought you could see this. So, and then I was just saying that we use the term alternative jet fuel rather than sustainable aviation fuel. All good. Hopefully you can see me switching between slides now. So I suppose the problem, if we just think about this from fundamentals, is we've got fossil fuels are carbon, basically it's biomass, but it's been stored for hundreds of thousands of years underground, and it's out of the atmosphere. We've reached stable atmospheric conditions. We're then gone through a period, the last 200 years, where we've been extracting that carbon. We've been processing it into fuels for our cars, our power stations, and our aircraft. And we've been adding additional carbon to the atmosphere, and that is building up and it's causing global warming. Now, the idea with alternative jet fuels is you take carbon from the atmosphere and use that for a fuel rather than access the fuels the carbon that's stored underground. So you can grow trees, you could grow crops, and when a crop grows, carbon is generated and it's from the atmosphere. You can also take water and you can electrolyze that into hydrogen, and you can then make a fuel from those. You can also suck carbon out of the atmosphere with something called direct air capture and get carbon that way. And if you combine your hydrogen and your carbon, you can create a liquid hydrocarbon fuel, and you can power that with renewable energy. And this all looks great. It means you've got like a closed loop system where the carbon comes from the air and it goes back to the air and take it back out of the air again, and you don't add any additional carbon. That is the principle behind what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to start with electrofuels or e-fuels. So these use energy. So just to explain, I suppose, what happens normally, we get an oil rig that sucks oil out of the ground. You extract that. The crude oil is then refined into petrol, diesel, kerosene. The kerosene goes into an aircraft. That burns the fuel. It generates CO2. Now, what we could do is we could do direct air capture. So this is the industrial process that takes carbon out of the air, and we could store the carbon back underground, and we could power that with renewable energy. And this is one option. This is very expensive. It's very energy intensive. But we could keep on burning fossil fuel and we could try and extract it back out of the air and bury it again. That's one option. But obviously that means that we're still using fossil fuels. Now, I think we will need to do some of this. Sorry, this is hydrogen. Yeah, so the next option is to create an electrofuel. So you start off with water, and there's something called electrolysis, which is a process where you have electricity and you split water, which is H2O, into hydrogen and oxygen, but you get rid of the oxygen and you're left with hydrogen. We can then also run direct air capture and suck carbon from the atmosphere, or take it from a power station and get some carbon that we've obtained industrially. You've got your hydrogen and your carbon. You can combine those synthesize them together into a hydrocarbon, and then you can burn that like you would a fossil fuel hydrocarbon in your aircraft and create CO2 and then capture that, and this is the process. The problem with this is, like I said, carbon capture is very energy intensive, and also electrolysis to create hydrogen is extremely energy intensive, and then combining these things into an e-fuel is again energy intensive. And also flying an aircraft is inefficient as well. So this is like one of the most inefficient processes that you could come up with. And just to give an example of this, I think what we need to think about, because this looks great, it looks like we're using just renewable electricity and we're able to fly, and we can do it. We've solved the problem. The problem is energy efficiency and its alternative uses of the same energy to do something else more effective. So this is a diagram I created, and just kind of, if you start at the top and you say we've got 100 units, 100% renewable electricity from wind or solar, what you can do with that energy is you could charge a battery in a car. Now, you lose about 10% of your energy charging a battery in a car, and then when you put it through the electric motor to drive the car, you lose about 10% again, but 80% of that energy is useful, and you power your car. And that means we can displace a lot of petrol or diesel from ground transport, and it's pretty efficient carbon abatement. Now, if you want to produce hydrogen gas, you perform electrolysis, and that you lose at least 30% energy just doing that. So you're already left with 70% of your energy. If you then want to turn it into a liquid, which is basically, if you want a hydrogen aircraft, you need to do this. There's additional energy lost, and you've lost half of your energy. If you want to combine to make an e-fuel, where you combine hydrogen with direct air capture and synthesis, you end up losing more than half of your energy just making the fuel as well. And then if you go and burn that in an engine, in an aircraft engine, you lose 2/3 of your energy again, and you're basically left with like 10-15% of your energy. Hydrogen as well, you're here, and then you've got a fuel cell or a combustor, and you lose about half of your energy. But you're still in. Hydrogen is really inefficient, and e-fuels is arguably even more inefficient. So doing these things, whether it's hydrogen or e-fuels, are just so, you end up wasting so much of your energy. And it's why we should really focus on stuff that is energy efficient as a priority. Given in any year over the next 10, 20 years, we're only going to have so much renewables. There's only so much we can build. We also need to think about how we prioritize it. So kind of to present this another way, this is a graph from the Committee on Climate Change. And what it shows is if you've got 1 unit of low carbon electricity from wind or from solar, how you can use that and how many tons of carbon you save. So the best thing you can do if you've got some coal power on the grid is you can get rid of your coal generation, and you save about 90% of a ton of CO2. With if you power an electric vehicle and get rid of petrol or diesel, it's 0.7, which is still pretty high because of the efficiencies I showed you. Powering a heat pump to displace a gas boiler in a home for heating a building is also a really efficient use with quite high carbon savings. Displacing fossil gas on the grid, once you've got rid of all your coal, the next thing you want to get rid of is gas. That's not quite as big a saving, but it's still pretty big. Then if you want to power direct air capture, then that's less efficient again, but you can see that maybe you might want to burn fossil fuels and do some of that. Producing hydrogen to displace gas is really inefficient, and then producing synthetic jet fuel is the least efficient thing you can do. It's like 7 times better to power an electric car, 6 times better to power a heat pump, 3 or 4 times better to displace gas on the grid. So this is not something we should be prioritizing, and the Committee on Climate Change say this. They say that we need to prioritize direct electrification over producing hydrogen and producing electrofuels. So that's really important. And to me, this also says if you do this, probably you're going to have to pay a high price for doing it. We can't assume this is going to be cheap. So yeah, literally the least efficient use of energy. And there's a big carbon opportunity cost of doing this. So we need to be mindful that probably this is not the best use. We might be able to do a little bit of it, but realistically, we're not going to be able to do loads soon. If you then do the calculations of how much energy would be required if you converted 100% of our jet fuel used in the UK today. So in the UK, we have about 12 million tons of kerosene used in recent years. If you made all of that with electro fuel, you'd need, I calculated, and this is actually like quite a conservative assumption, I think you need more energy. You need more than 300 terawatt hours of energy. That might not mean much to you, but basically the total grid, the entire power system in the UK, is about equivalent to that. And half of that, which is the grey area, is fossil fuels. Orange is nuclear, blue is some other energy like hydro, and then green is wind energy. So basically, you need twice our current non-fossil fuel supply, including nuclear. You need 3 times our renewable energy supply, 4 times our current wind supply, 5 times our current nuclear generation. So this could be possible if we multiplied our current nuclear power stations by 5, we'd be able to do this. That shows you how much energy is required. To put this into context for wind power, I calculated you need 80 gigawatts of offshore wind, and that translates to a circle of offshore wind that's 135 kilometers wide, and is basically equivalent to the size of Northern Ireland. It's an area larger than Northern Ireland. Can I kind of compare what that looks like? This is our current offshore wind that's being built, and it's sort of bigger than all of that combined. And it's, if you look at the Committee on Climate Change, how much offshore wind they're saying we should have by 2050, it's about equivalent to that. So it would require like all of our offshore wind in 2050 just for the aviation sector. So it's a massive amount. And this is something like the aviation industry completely acknowledge. So this is a report produced by a lot of companies that you might recognize that operate in aviation. They're saying if we decarbonize aviation using liquid hydrogen or synthetic fuels, we need to triple or quintuple renewable energy produced globally today. In other words, demand for renewable energy would be 20 to 30 times higher than renewable energy produced in Europe today. So it's absolutely massive, and the industry admits this. And this is the CEO of Lufthansa saying, if we did it in Germany, we'd need half of Germany's electricity if we were to switch to e-fuels. So our positions on this is that basically e-fuels are currently too energy intensive to scale significantly without diverting limited renewable electricity from elsewhere. What we need to do is we need to perform a cross-economy prioritization of renewable electricity before we assume massive quantities for aviation fuel. Now, while other sectors like the grid, ground transport, heating industry are decarbonising, there's a big opportunity cost to diverting that electricity to aviation rather than elsewhere. And within aviation, it actually appears to just be more efficient to tax jet fuel, make fossil fuel more expensive, and maybe use part of that money to fund direct air capture rather than producing an e-fuel. Either way, it's going to have to get a lot more expensive to burn fuel, either because you're running a carbon capture or because you're producing an e-fuel that's massively expensive. However, direct air capture itself is also very inefficient. Like I showed you, it's more efficient before we do that to like fund electric ground transport and heat pumps for homes. In the near term, probably we need to ramp up aviation fuel or emissions pricing and use that money primarily to just fund renewables and direct electrification of the grid to make things more cheaper for everybody, and so that we decarbonize the stuff that makes sense first. So hopefully that makes sense. Those are our positions. I said they're quite detailed, but we've had to think about this in detail because we're aviation workers, and this is really important. So the next step is biofuels. Now, I would kind of categorize biofuels into 3 categories and then some further subcategories. So the first one is crop-based biofuel. Then there is waste oil fat from used cooking oil and from animal fat. And then there's other wastes that are more difficult to process. There's food waste, there's farm waste, and there's forestry waste. So yeah, farm waste could be anything. Like if you've got corn and you've got the sheaths and the stems and the stuff that isn't edible. Forestry waste, it could be bark, leaves, branches, that kind of thing. If you're cutting down trees, sawdust in your sawmill, that kind of thing. Crop-based biofuels, we'll start off there. So it's generally recognized now that crop-based biofuels produce more emissions than fossil fuels. It's dependent on the crop, it's dependent on where you are in the world, but all of them are worse than fossil fuel. Soy is particularly bad because it causes deforestation, generally in Central South America. Palm oil is particularly bad because it causes deforestation in Southeast Asia primarily, and it also causes you to drain peat bogs, and that land use change has a massive climate impact because of the land use change emissions. So crop-based biofuels are actually making the problem worse, like a cure worse than the disease. However, if you look, this is a graph, I found this graph quite interesting. It's domestic corn production in America, in the US, over the last 40 years. And you can see that growing corn for food, which is the gray areas, like barely any corn is grown for food. I think it's less than like 2%. The majority is grown for animal feed. And then over time, over the last 20 years in particular, there's been a massive growth in corn ethanol biofuels that basically been feeding cars and trucks. Now, this is just a really terrible use of land. And to show you why, have a look at this. So this is the area that is required for a solar panel to power an electric car. If you want to power a car for the same distance that you could power off a solar panel that size, you'd need massive more amount of land. And it's like multiple hundreds times more land. The reason is because a solar panel is 20% efficient at converting solar into stored energy. Plant matter is about less than 1% efficient. So it's a really inefficient way to turn sunlight into stored energy, and it's not a good use of land. Now, if we have a look at on a global level and also like a US level, there's current aviation fuel demand and there's current biofuel production, and you can see whether you look at it on a global level or a US level. At the moment, biofuels are produced, mostly used in ground transport, but you'd still need 3 times that amount to meet aviation demand without any growth. So we need to use all of the crops that are currently used for ground transport, and we need to triple it as well. If we have a business as usual scenario, where we grow jet fuel use and we 100% replace it with biofuels, we'd need, I think, 300 million hectares of cropland. That's basically an area the size of India, and India is one of the biggest agricultural nations in the world. It's similar in size to America. We need that entire area just for aviation. So this is basically why we can't use biofuels from crops, is that the sheer land involved will lead to deforestation, and it'll make the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis worse. Just thinking about the UK, because obviously most of you are based in the UK, we need half the farmland in the UK to make enough aviation fuel. That's from a Royal Society report that was from last year. So summary is we really need to avoid crop-based biofuels. This argument has not been won, unfortunately. In America, Joe Biden in the Inflation Reduction Act is putting a lot of subsidies into this. Unfortunately, the agricultural lobby in the US is particularly strong, and that's also encouraging other countries around the world to also use these. So there's still a big fight on to ban crop-based biofuels, and I think it's going to be a point of debate and a point of something we need to fight over. So in the UK and Europe, we say we're not going to use crop-based biofuels though. And the first thing that we talk about is a process called HEFA, which is hydroesters of fatty acids, or in layman's terms, it's using waste oil and fat to make biofuel. So either used cooking oil from a chip pan or animal fat from animal agriculture. You need a lot of dead pigs. Apparently you need about 9,000 dead pigs just for a Paris to New York flight. So you really can't scale up animal fat, but also you can't scale up used cooking oil because there's not that much of it. The big problem with using used cooking oil is that actually what we tend to do is we don't have that much in the UK. So we are exporting a lot of it from Asia, and they appear to be exporting more than they're collecting. So we believe as a result that actually just palm oil is being cut down, either to be sold as used cooking oil or to displace the things that used cooking oil has been taken away from. That's causing deforestation, and that's increasing global warming. There's been a lot of concerns raised around fraud of virgin oil being used as waste oil. But the reality is that there's just really not much. So we're really limited on how much we can scale. We have challenged the UK government on this. We think, so they've introduced something they call the Sustainable Aviation Fuel mandate that mandates 10% jet fuel by 2030. But so 10% there by 2030, but they allow 7% to come from this HEFA, the waste oil fat feedstock. Now, there's studies that show that you can't even get to 2% before you basically bottom out of this. This is a study looking at the resource across Europe. If we want to go above 1-2%, we need to start looking at other sources. But none of those have been developed yet, and we're just relying on this one. So likely what we're going to do is we're going to seek this used cooking oil, we're going to generate fraudulent markets for it, and we're actually just going to run out of it as well. The factories aren't going to be able to source the feedstock. Now, again, our industry acknowledged this. So Michael O'Leary, obviously really prominent CEO of Ryanair, says there isn't enough used cooking oil in the world to power one day of green aviation. CEO of Qatar Airways says, don't fool ourselves, we won't be able to reach the targets we have for 2030. There's not enough raw material to get the volumes of SAF. So like literally we're admitting this. It's not just like me saying this, it's like big leaders of the industry will openly admit that these targets are impossible to meet. The other thing, if you think about it, we're shipping cooking oil halfway across the world from China and Malaysia in particular. That's causing additional emissions. It makes sense if you collect used cooking oil in China to just use it there. And they have introduced their own SAF mandate recently. And this puts in great question a lot of the refineries being built in Europe and the UK, which are reliant on importing it from there. The other question is, why would we prioritize this feedstock for aircraft over biodiesel, which can be used in trucks and ships? These are difficult to electrify as well. And basically it's more efficient to use this feedstock here as well. So our positions are, we should prioritize firstly reducing waste oil and fat in the first place. We also should prioritize local production of biofuels where it is collected. Prioritize ground transport over jet fuel as that's most efficient. And we should cap HEFA at lower quantities in North America and Europe to prevent creating a fraudulent market for virgin vegetable oil, diverting from local fuel production, diverting from ground transport, and most importantly, sort of distracting our industry's attention away from other more scalable fuels and other things that we need to do. At the moment, it's just a big distraction over a fuel that literally cannot be scaled and is a dead end. So next up, how much time am I on? Okay, I'll try and be quick because I think I've been talking for a while. So food waste is next. I found this one particularly egregious. This is United Airlines using Sesame Street character who's a chief trash officer, and they're talking about turning food waste into fuel. This is an advert that you can find on YouTube. I'm just pointing here, you might not be able to see it, but in the small print it says SAF is less than 0.1% of United's overall fuel use. They also talk about algae in this video, and they say algae is not currently used to make SAF in the small print as well. So it's quite a lot of misinformation. Just to look at what we're doing in the UK, this is a facility that I'm particularly concerned about. It's the one that's allegedly got the most funding in Teesside. It's called the Lighthouse Green Fuels Project, and it's an Alphanar Energy, who are owned by Saudi Arabia. They have got 11 million of UK funding from the government, but they've also got $1 billion of Alphanar investment from the Saudi government. So it's located in Teesside near Middlesbrough, and they're claiming this is like a levelling up project, but you can see they're using municipal solid waste or black bin waste. So something that you've collected in your kitchen and you've gone and put in the general waste. Now we know that is going to be a mixture of plastic and food waste if people haven't got a compost system, if they don't have food waste collection. If you think about the different elements of that, so firstly, you've got plastic waste. Now, conventional jet fuel, you extract oil, you process it in a refinery, that produces CO2 emissions, you then burn it in an aircraft, that produces more CO2. With this, we're taking oil from the ground, we're processing it in a refinery, again with emissions, we're making some plastic product. That product then needs to be collected. Again, there's emissions there in collecting and processing, and in refining to make a fuel to then make more carbon again. And this is actually likely to produce even more emissions than just using fossil fuel in the first place. So the plastic element of black bin bag waste is not good. The biogenic waste, so that is going to rot if you just leave it by itself and produce methane. And you could say, well, if we avoid that, then that's good. However, there's better uses of food waste as well. So if you do have food waste, you can put that in something called an anaerobic digestion plant. That will produce organic fertilizer. All the nutrients that are in that food waste get reused, go back into the soil, are used for growing more crops. You also create some biogas. You can use that to displace fossil gas on the grid and in people's homes until we decarbonise. This is much more efficient use and more circular use of food waste. The UK government, I'm just showing you this because this is from DEFRA, the UK government's own materials. They talk about anaerobic digestion and composting as stage 3 in their hierarchy. Stage 4, lower in the hierarchy, is recovering energy from that material, and that's just above disposal. So we should be prioritizing recycling nutrients to produce fertilizer over recovering for energy. Again, this is just another hierarchy from DEFRA on food waste. If you can't eat it, you should either feed it to an animal, use it to make biomaterials, or recycle it, anaerobic digestion and compost, rather than recover the energy. And that includes turning it into SAF. So literally the government's own guidance, this is going against. Final thing I want to talk about here is just if you look at the fertilizer industry, there's also concerns because we've got interconnected, interrelated issues here, kind of multi-crisis. We've got the crisis of fertilizer where we're running out of critical fertilizer materials. Currently, we use fossil fuels. Currently, the fertilizer industry produces almost as much emissions as aviation. So we really need to decarbonize that. We need to be using our organic material for that as a priority, I think, or we need good evidence otherwise. So just to kind of wrap up then, there's some other waste-based biofuels. So forestry residues, agricultural residues, things that you can't eat and maybe don't compost well. Now, some people think that there is enough biofuels to cover aviation. I'm including these here. You're welcome to go take a look at someone that's got a different opinion from me. I think that's important. But let's just have a think about this. There's obviously straw as a byproduct. If you grow some corn, you take all of the kernels off. You've got the middle part that can't be eaten. If you have forestry and you've got bark or sawdust, you can't do that much useful with those. Okay, you could turn that into an advanced biofuel. The first thing is these are not the energetic part of the crop, so they're really difficult to break down into a chemical that can then be readily burned as a fuel. It takes a lot of energy. The other thing you can do is you can use rice husks or corn cobs to make biomaterials, or you could use sawdust to make insulating materials, things that can replace plastics, can replace fossil fuel products with something organic. The other thing you can do is you can use it for bioenergy, but you can use it for bioenergy on the ground. That can help balance out the grid. As we have renewables at the moment, we're relying on gas to balance the grid, so we can use bioenergy there, and we can also apply carbon capture to it. Whereas you obviously can't do that if you turn it into bioenergy and burn it in an aircraft engine. You can't apply carbon capture to that at all. Difficult to do on the ground. I'm not saying that's not without its problems, but that's probably preferable over burning in an aircraft engine. Again, the industry admit this themselves, that the aviation industry will be competing with other interests that need that feedstock for other things. And they mention land use change, water use, monoculture, all as issues. They acknowledge this themselves. Transport and Environment did a study looking at what's possible with advanced biofuels, and they concluded for Europe that you could only get about 11% of aviation demand from that. But you also need to consider all these competing uses: fertilizer, bioenergy, carbon capture, road transport. For the next 20 years, we're not going to be able to completely electrify. Shipping fuels, again, difficult to electrify. Bioplastics. And we need to do a cross-sector analysis of all of this stuff. We can't just assume it all for aviation. I won't go into this as well, but Shell show this as well. They show that their low estimate of what's available with bioenergy, aviation could use all of that, but there's a bunch of other sectors that need it as well. There's a big demand and there's a massive supply shortage. This graph, I'm going to skip over this one, but it just shows that as we collect biomass, we can collect some and it's quite low cost. And then when we go above a level, it becomes really high cost because it's really difficult to collect and it becomes very expensive. The summary really is just that we need to assume, even if we can do this, that it's going to get really expensive, and that will make it expensive to fly. And then we should question our growth models. So positions. We think biofuels are not sustainable to a significant percentage of jet fuel demand. Maybe we're going to get 5-10% from it, but not more than that, without diverting limited sustainable biomass from elsewhere. We think we need to prioritize reducing biomass waste in the first place, prioritize local use of it where it's collected. Again, cross-economy prioritization before assuming it for aviation, and probably recognize it's better used elsewhere. Prioritize fertilizer use over jet fuel production. And if we do use some for jet fuel, we've got to assume it's going to be high cost, and that's going to affect the growth projections of the industry, and then that has an impact on whether an airport expansion is a good idea or not. So just in summary, we think this focus on sustainable aviation fuels as a talking point is really distracting us from policies targeting fossil fuels. So like a carbon budget for aviation that reduces each year and is applied to airports and limits carbon from individual airports. Financial policies like jet fuel tax and frequent flyer levies. We advocate that we stop using this term, sustainable aviation fuel, and start using alternative jet fuel instead. I've mentioned this a few times. I think we really need a cross-economy prioritization of all of our non-fossil resources. We think biofuels are not scalable without diverting limited biomass from elsewhere. E-fuels are more scalable, but they're too energy intensive to scale in the short term. We should scale renewables, but we should use our limited renewable electricity elsewhere first. We don't think that the SAF targets will be met. So the UK have set this 10% SAF by 2030. We think this is almost physically impossible to meet, particularly if we grow air traffic. Funding is really important. We want to recognize these alternative fuels are way more expensive than conventional jet fuel. That shouldn't be subsidized, most likely by everyone in the country, in the world. It should be paid for by air travelers themselves. That should be factored into business models of the airlines, and that should change our growth plans. Some types of SAF are particularly unsustainable and unscalable, like the waste oil. We really risk spending a lot of government money as well at the moment on the wrong technology that turns out to be a dead end and a white elephant. We prefer government money to be spent elsewhere. Within the energy sector, just building renewables. Within transport sector, electrifying ground transport. And within aviation, where government money is directed to aviation, into developing more radically efficient aircraft designs to minimize total jet fuel that's burned regardless of the fuel. The other thing about that is it will create genuine aviation worker jobs, whereas we see funding for SAF will probably just go to the energy sector and prop up fossil fuel companies further. So positive story from this, because there's a lot of negatives. We can stop wasting our money and time on these inefficient fuel projects and fund more efficient activities instead. We're in this climate emergency where we need to act and prioritize, and this is quite clear what we need to do here, I think. Aviation can be a force for good in the world if we accelerate decarbonisation of other sectors. And yeah, that's going to reduce costs for the majority and reduce inequality. If we focus on policies that target fossil fuels and we drive down carbon emissions, we can keep our planet habitable. Tourist destinations will still be visitable. We won't have destroyed the Great Barrier Reef and the Amazon rainforest, and there will still be an aviation sector in the future. And higher emissions pricing, higher pricing of fossil fuel will incentivize aviation companies to innovate. That'll drive technology development and create more jobs, and we should be in favor of that as aviation workers. So yeah, that's my summary, and I'll stop sharing. And sorry for taking a while. I know we had a bit of time at the start, but I tend to go into a lot of detail. So thanks for listening to me.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. So much. I'm just going to try and get you back with everybody. Yeah, don't know how to do that, but anyway, I'm going to give up. Right, so we have questions coming in on the chat. So I think if we ask Professor Dan Osborne, he's keen to, are you going to make your slides available? But Dan, do you want to switch your microphone on and ask your question yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. In the Sustainable Aviation Roadmap, Finlay, 39% of the reduction in emissions to get aviation to net zero by 2050 would come from SAFs. Is that just simply, in your organisation's view, magical thinking by the sector and the government? Oh, you're muted, Finlay.
Apologies. Yeah, so for all the reasons I laid out, I think it's going to be very difficult to meet even the short-term targets for 2030. And I suppose the number that you're giving us for 2050. When you look at these roadmaps, they tend to show not much progress for like the next 15, 20 years, and then everything after 2040. So it's like putting all of the burden on a future generation rather than us to scale up. And I think what we'll find is before we get there, we realize that we're failing in all these other sectors and we really need to focus energy there. So if I was betting on it, I would say that we're going to miss those targets. I think there's magical thinking also around the cost. Like the industry says we're going to scale it, but also we're not going to pay for it. Government, you need to pay for it. And at the moment, governments don't have that much money. And they need tens of billions. They need hundreds of billions per year globally. So this is a lobbying tactic because they want to get the maximum money from the government. But realistically, there isn't the money there. And the money's a massive amount of money. Because of the inefficiencies of these things, it just makes it fundamentally expensive, and we're not acknowledging those costs, and we're not acknowledging we need to raise a lot of money for that, and that would mean making flying more expensive. So I think the biggest bit of magical thinking is saying we're going to scale these things while somehow not paying for it. And even if you think those targets are real, you need to acknowledge the costs, and then that has a big impact on. It would really transform, like the costs are so high, it would transform air travel because flying a long distance would become very, very expensive. So yeah, we're kind of having our cake and eat it kind of putting these really ambitious high targets up and then not paying anything to get the fuels going. And yet there is only one fuel that's being commercialized, and it's the waste oil and fat. So we haven't even proven any other fuel type at commercial scale.
Thank you. And also there's another question.
Yeah.
The type of aircraft. So you know, and how many passengers will they carry? I mean, at the moment, SAF can, or alternative aviation fuel, can go into the planes they fly today.
Yeah, so I'm going to put some in the chat as well. So so one of them is blended wing body. That's what you'd go to if like we actually kind of know what the most efficient aircraft would look like, but again, it's sort of commercial. Because jet fuel is cheap, we haven't taken the jump to more radically efficient aircraft designs and engine designs. So blended wing body is the most efficient thing you could do, and that's because you're in you don't have a tube and wing. The fuselage becomes the wing, and the whole thing generates lift. But that's a very different design to what Airbus and Boeing are used to making. And it would probably cost 30, 40 billion to develop an aircraft like this. There is a group called Jet Zero in the US that are doing a small scale prototype of this. It's not going to be, you know, the other thing to say is, right, we're going to develop an aircraft like that. And then on an engine side, something called open rotor, where instead of a nacelle around the engine, you have something that looks more like 2 rows of propellers. And that's just really efficient. But again, there's design challenges and there's expense that comes with developing that. With both the aircraft and the engines, you know, even if we decided to go full on the development of those, it would take at least 15 years to develop them. So we're looking at late 2030s, 2040 before we've got. So they're also not going to solve anything today. But the point is, if we get out of denial mode, we say actually we need to develop those quickly, and then actually there would be a lot of engineering jobs developing them, and we also need to change our airports for them. So there's actually a lot of work for aviation workers designing and developing and implementing a more efficient air transport network, but that needs to be one that has less energy use and less flying overall, as well as just the aircraft efficiency.
Thank you. There's another one from Greenpeace. Sorry, it says short-haul island hopping battery power. Is that viable?
Yeah. So batteries are batteries themselves are not energy dense. So they've got a big problem with weight and volume. Electric motors are very efficient, but the thing that kills you is the weight. So you then really struggle with current battery technology to get an aircraft that can carry many people and fly very far. But what I think we'll see in the next 5 years is we will see the first electric aircraft certified. I think they'll have certainly less than 30 people, probably less than 20 people, and probably flying for like 1 or 2 hours at most. So this isn't going to be something that displaces the majority of air traffic. Like flights from Gatwick, most of them are carrying 300 people, like 200 or 300 people, and they're flying for a few hours or even 10, 15 hours, right? So that's not going to be possible. But yes, if you're in Glasgow and you fly to a Scottish island, or maybe from Dublin to Liverpool, like that's possible. But also, so not very far and carrying not many people. But that is exciting, and the thing is you can say about that is there will be some more jobs from that. The other thing that we say around airport expansion at the moment is it's not most airports that are being proposed. The terminals are being designed for a battery electric aircraft. They're being designed for long range fossil fuel powered aircraft. So if the industry really believes this is going to happen, we need to change our airports and transform them rather than expand them. Yeah, and I can see the next question is about hydrogen. So hydrogen again is similar, like it promises less weight but volume. So hydrogen takes up 4 times the amount of space that jet fuel does. So you need to design a really different aircraft. We have the same energy issues that you have with e-fuels. It's a bit more efficient in fuel production, but then it's got challenges in putting it in the aircraft and flying. An electro fuel is more difficult to produce, but you can put it in an existing aircraft. Hydrogen, you need to redesign the aircraft. And again, you're then looking at, you're not going to have anything of significant size for the next 10, 15 years. Zero Avia, who you mentioned, are doing a small one. So we will see, again, like probably hydrogen fuel cell aircraft, but it'll probably like have 20 passengers and it won't fly very far. So it'll sort of be hydrogen versus batteries. To be honest, I kind of suspect batteries will actually win this out because of cost. And but it's to be seen, and I think we need to try both. But the main thing is we can't assume that those things are going to come along and decarbonize aviation as a whole. Like we need to be realistic that they're not going to do that in the timescales. Yeah.
Okay, so has anybody else got any questions? Because we are coming up to the hour. If you can just...
Yep, I've got a question.
Okay.
Have you, Finley,
right. Yeah.
Have you seen any research regarding and the impact on the climate, about how the concentration of flights and how they're currently flown? Because there's a bit of research being done at the moment, and they've noticed now they've closed down the West flying over Russia. It's actually had a positive impact on the climate. So could that actually, could we reduce the amount of impact by aviation if they change their routing?
I'd actually thought that the Russian airspace had made it worse because they were having to fly a longer route. So
correct. Yeah. But based on the calculations they've done, even though they're flying further, the climate impact and the concentration of pollutants is actually reducing.
So if that's the case, it's probably because of the contrails. So contrails is slightly different. Again, we're slightly straying from the sustainable aviation fuel topic. But basically, contrails, best thing to do is probably for me to link you to an article we've written on this, because it's quite a detailed subject. But we are really keen on mitigating contrails because it's relatively easy to do, and it is just about flying in a different part of the sky. So I'll share, best thing to do is I'll share a blog post on this, and feel free to get in contact with us if you'd like to know more.
That's really that's really kind to do that. And also Jill Sutcliffe's just got a quick question for you, Jill.
I've forgotten it now. My quick question was, it's gone out my head. Sorry.
That's all right, Jill, not to worry. Okay, all right. So thank you for that. And Finley has just put the details in the chat. So if you're unable to save that, get in touch afterwards, and I'll certainly send you the link. But I'm sure it's on Safe Landing's website as well.
Yeah, there's also, just in terms of our sustainable aviation fuel position, I'm just linking that there. That's got a recording of me doing this talk before, and it's everything I was talking to you about in a website.
Okay. Jill, I think Jill's just remembered her question for you. Go ahead, Jill.
Have you given this talk to government?
Very good question.
Well, we've submitted, we submitted to the government consultations before, and I've also talked to other people that work at Cambridge that have engaged the government on their mandate, and they advised them they shouldn't make the waste oil more than 2%, and they went and made it 7%. So I just feel like they were unwilling to listen, particularly the previous government. Obviously, to some extent with the new government, the jury is still out, because we don't know what they're going to say. Are they going to update their aviation strategy? They've been very tight-lipped on that. But the old government were very ideologically opposed to putting limits on flying.
Mm.
And then the only way you can do that is to claim that carbon offsetting and sustainable aviation fuels are going to work.
Mm.
So they sort of then needed to do that, and they forced through their agenda on that rather than listen to evidence. And the evidence is there for everyone to see, I think. So the answer is we did engage with the previous government consultations, but I think our evidence was rejected. And we're keen to try and engage with this new government now. But I not really had like the evidence that I think they're a bit nervous to discuss this actually.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think what's sad that they've just adopted what went before and haven't actually looked to review it or question, and I think that's what needs to happen. So I think we all need to be writing to the Right Honourable Louise Hay, the Secretary of State for Transport, asking her to review, or even Mike Kane. But I think we might stand more chance with Louise Hay than Mike Kane, who's the aviation minister.
Well, I think something to think about with this, if you do talk to anyone that is in politics about this, is the thing that they don't want to do is they want to minimize their spending, and they don't want to waste money. The thing about sustainable aviation fuel is there's the ability to waste billions of public money on a dead end. And actually it's quite a liberating thing to say a lot of this is a waste of money. We actually can cut this area and we can focus on something else. And even if you're going to look at sustainable aviation fuel, some of them are better than others, and we need to have a proper evidence-based discussion about which ones to prioritize, so that we don't. And I think hopefully they will be more amenable to that discussion.
Lovely. Okay, all right, I'm going to sort of wrap this up now with a huge thank you to Finlay and all his team at Safe Landing, and I will share the links if you get in touch with me, but it will go out in our bulletin along with the recording that Finlay's kindly offered, and this time is ticking recording will go onto our YouTube channel. I hope you all saw today Dale Vince sent out a video on social media opposing the new runway at Gatwick Airport. Love him or hate him, we're delighted to have his support in opposing a new runway at Gatwick Airport. We'll find out next Tuesday. Well, we won't find out anything, but the recommendations from the Planning Inspectorate will go to Louise Hay, Secretary of State for Transport, and she's due to make her decision and on the 27th of February next year. So it's going to be a busy 2025 because we've got the public consultation on airspace change in the first quarter, and we've also got Route 4 consultation in the second quarter, plus obviously the announcement on the second runway. CAGNY is already working with the team of legals and experts ready for that decision. So if you have a few pennies to spare, we'd love some pledges, because we only have 10 days to demand a judicial review, or to support Louise Hay when she turns the second runway down, because I'm sure Gatwick will go to appeal. Anyway, thank you so much for everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you, huge thank you to Finlay. Please stay in touch with us all, and we'll see you very soon. If you need any help, just get in touch with CAGNY. We're here to help. Thank you again, Finlay. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good evening, guys.
Thank you.